Quilting has been around for hundreds of years, so you think it's all been done before. But every year there are new quilters arriving on the scene who find new ways to make their patterns fresh and exciting. From my home guild in Toronto, Cristina De Miranda of Ships and Violins has only been quilting for a short while. I remember seeing her at her first show and tell and thinking, this quilter has something new. Since then, her quilts have hung at Quiltcon and her patterns have been published in the MQG's Quilt of the Month and in Simply Modern. So grab your sewing and a cup of tea, and here's my interview with Cristina De Miranda. Welcome, Cristina, to the show. Thank you so much for being on. We have our Toronto Modern Guild in common. You just sort of exploded on the scene. You were so excited. We were so excited to see all your new designs and ideas. When did you make your first quilt?
Thank you for having me, first of all. My first quilt was made in 2018. It was after a colleague I was working with introduced me to quilting, and she showed me one of her quilts, and I was just so excited about what she showed me. It was colorful, the scale was big, it just seemed unbelievable that she had made this thing, and it just got me itching to make my own. And so my first quilt that I ever made was Crisscross Applesauce by Vanessa & Co. And it was just a block repeated. I made the throw size, and that was kind of history. I just absolutely loved working with the fabrics and just working through the process of quilting.
Did you take a class or did you just learn it on your own?
So I knew how to sew from about 8 years prior to that. I learned how to sew a bag and a skirt, and then I never really sewed after that again, unless it was like curtains or something. And so I figured I pretty well had the basics to start quilting. So I actually binged a course on Craftsy, and I watched the entire thing in a single sitting from start to finish. It was by Gail Kessler, and she taught you how to start a quilt, everything you needed, and how to finish it. And that was it. That's all I needed. A little bit of guidance for sure, but I got right to it, and it all made sense when I was working on it.
Was there a difficulty that just surprised you?
I think a lot of people say that quilting is a marathon. And I think part of the difficulty, while I was really excited to be working through the process, it was a long process. And so there were moments in it where I was like, I don't know if I'm going to finish this thing, even though I was really excited about it. And one of the things that I think benefits a lot of people is the fact that you're working through so many different stages. And when you sort of get tired of doing one, you're very near the next one. So you can kind of just rally yourself to finish. And then the quilting process was the most daunting, for sure. I mean, my quilting lines were not great. The stitches were not even. My hands hurt, my shoulders hurt, but I did end up doing it. So it was good.
So do you still own that quilt or did you give it away?
No, I have it. I do have it. It was for me. The color palette, I don't know if anybody would have liked it, but it's on our couch now.
So what part of quilting really triggered your brain? What was the part that really pulled you in?
It took me a long time to figure out and honor the fact that I was a maker. Like I never really, it was always there. I was always artsy. I was always interested in crafts, but I never really sat down and made it a priority. And so when I was able to work with my hands to build something, to create something from scratch, it was incredibly freeing and thrilling to do. So that was really what got me started. The fact that I could use my hands, that I could walk around and stop and start when I needed to, move on to a new stage when I wanted to. It just felt like fun. It really did. So it was the making and the being able to touch a textile, create something real with the textile. I initially started as a professional writer. I thought I was going to be an author. I thought I was going to write novels, bestsellers. And there was something about, while I loved being creative, there was something about sitting at a desk and writing that just was difficult for me. I could not, garner enough interest to bring myself there every single day, even though I wanted to tell stories. And I think that's because it wasn't as hands-on as I think I am as a person. So quilting allowed me to be hands-on, and in some ways still allows me to storytell, but visually rather than with words.
Has color been a part of your life before you started quilting?
I was kind of thinking about this question because I used to tell everybody, when I walked into a room or I saw something that was really made me happy, I would always say, I just love the colors here. It was such a simple fact. It just brought me joy. And I think a lot of quilters feel that way too. There's something really intrinsic about absorbing all these wonderful, joyful colors. And it feels very, very real and emotional. And so I think another reason that quilting really attracted me was I was able to pull this feeling I was getting and now have a say in it almost, and build it myself. So I always loved color, and this was really a great way to be working with it.
Were there any other crafters or quilters in your family?
Yes and no. My grandmother is a sewist, so she sewed a lot of her own clothes, and she sewed Barbie clothes for my Barbie dolls and stuff, and she quilted some placemats, but it was more functional. It wasn't necessarily her hobby. She did it for a very specific purpose, and I'm not sure if she ever found it to be an art form as a way for her to express herself. But it was an incredible tool for her to have, and I was able to inherit some of her things, which was really, really nice. And she was really the only sewist in our family, and she's still with us, and I see her, and I always bring a quilt, and she's just so flabbergasted by everything. It is so nice. She gives me the best reactions to all of my quilts because she understands it. So really, I knew of sewing from my grandmother, but I really pursued it on my own.
Has it been difficult to bring up your sewing skills to match your design ideas?
So that's been probably the biggest learning curve, because I design my quilts. First, I design illustrations. So I don't limit myself to quilt blocks. I don't even think about how I'm going to construct my quilts. I just want to have an image on the screen that speaks to me. And then once I've decided that, I then have to figure out how to make it into a quilt pattern, which certainly can be difficult. And each one is different. If you know my quilts, like, they're all over the place, and that's what's exciting for me as a designer. And it's one of the reasons so many of my quilt patterns end up being paper piece patterns, because it's such a simple way to take some of my more complex designs and be able to communicate that to everybody else accurately and effectively. But yeah, there's definitely a learning curve there.
I remember Andrea Sang Jackson of Third Story Workshop when she came and spoke to the Toronto Modern Guild, saying the very same thing. Like, she had a design idea and she was bringing up her skills to implement it. And it was a big aha moment in my head, because I think that's the difference between a modern quilter and a traditional quilter. I think a modern quilter has that vision, or is on a path to making something, where a traditional quilter is starting with a block. They can do amazing things with it. I'm not saying one's righter than the other. I think the difference is that approach. One is coming this way and the other one's coming that way.
Right. And at what stage you decide this is going to be a quilt, right? I think traditional quilters approach it and they know they're making a quilt. And sometimes I don't know that I am making a quilt. It's really just an exploration, a discovery using my illustration tools. And then once something really sticks, then I kind of move into that quilt pattern world.
Speaking of not sure that it's going to be a quilt, you've got a couple of pillows in Simply Modern this past year. How did that happen?
So I designed that quilt. It's called Ala Dejana. I designed it last Christmas during COVID. It's based on a Portuguese woven blanket. So the scale is much larger, obviously, than the woven blanket, but the piecing's quite small, so I could still get enough that everyone could read it. And it was really a bit of a coping mechanism. It was a very personal project. It wasn't meant to be a quilt pattern. It was just how I wanted to spend my holidays, given that we were all kind of isolated. And I think it was really, really well received. And I ended up pitching it to Simply Modern as something that I thought would fit their look. And the editor loved it. And so I made a couple of pillows based on one of the repeating elements in that quilt.
It's a beautiful photograph and beautiful pillows. Your Badlands quilt was the Modern Quilt Guild pattern of the month in 2020, I believe. You designed it one way with lots of bright blues and oranges, but the Modern Guild wanted you to make it out of coral and olive. Were you afraid how that was going to turn out?
I wasn't afraid, but I needed to play with it quite a bit before I landed on something I liked. As a designer, sometimes we get stuck in our first design and we think this is the winning one. I can't possibly edit it or change it. even the colors. So they kind of forced me to step out of that zone and try something new. And it's because of that colorway that it ended up getting the name the Badlands, right? It's the corals, it was the greens that started to set a desert like scene. So it was really nice to kind of see even my designs, how they take on names and how they create different feelings. I mean, that's what we want from our quilts. We want them to be able to transform, to almost be like chameleons, depending on who is making them.
It turned out fabulous. I can remember seeing it going, wow. Who would have thought of putting those together to get that result? But that was a real showstopper.
Thank you. Yeah, it's traditionally pieced, so I didn't use FPP for that one, which was in itself another learning curve for me. But I really loved it. And I think it really embodies a lot of the design elements that I continue to see in my quilts. And when I was developing my through quilting lecture, I had to kind of be really thoughtful about what I was saying about my quilts. And that's when I started to realize there's a lot of things I repeat over and over, not necessarily intentionally, but those are the things that end up catching my eye. And for the Badlands, the reason I love that quilt is the stripped piecing in the background creates is just so interesting. I really didn't want to have a plain background. And then the oblongs that appear to sit on top of those stripes there's some overlap. So they added depth to the whole design. Anyways, it was very interesting to work on that pattern.
Well, you mentioned your trunk show through quilting. You presented it to the Toronto Modern Guild. It's very good. But at what point in your through quilting did you realize there's a uniqueness about your design? You've got a very distinct voice from other quilters.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that. It's good to hear. When did I realize? I think right when I started to design my patterns, because I approached it in the way that I was seeing others approach it. You know, the modern quilting community was thriving when I decided to appear, and I thought I would start by copying what I was seeing other people do, which was a lot of block-based quilt designs repeated with really playful modern colors. And I think it only took me a quilt or two before I realized this isn't quite my aesthetic. I wanted more asymmetry. I wanted more depth. I wanted also overall designs, something that, you would have to view in totality. And not everyone was doing that, right? Especially, the really popular modern quilters who have incredibly successful businesses. They weren't quite doing that. So I felt like I did have to take my fork in the road and trust that my aesthetic and my design, if people didn't want to make it necessarily, that at least they would find it interesting, and that really drives me as a creator.
Many of us love quilting so much that we want to quit our day job. At what point did you think that you could do that and start a business?
It was in 2018, a few months after I made my first quilt. And it wasn't quilting necessarily that made me quit my job by any means. It was the discovery that I needed to kind of feed my soul with creativity. Like I said, I had thought I was going to be an art author. I thought I was going to be an artist. Like that was who I identified with. And life takes you where it takes you, and you end up in a spot. And at that particular time, it didn't feel quite right. And so when I discovered quilting, it lit a fire, and I thought, I have to feed the creativity in myself and take it seriously. We're only getting older, and I really wanted creativity to be a part of my career in a meaningful way. And so when I quit my job, I actually thought I was going to be a graphic designer. That's what I thought I was going to do. But because I was also simultaneously building, my quilting skills and getting quite excited about that craft, that's where I ended up leading. Graphic design has been integral to my quilting, but running this small little business is what really is exciting to me.
How long did it take to make that decision?
So after I quit my job, I gave myself about 6 months to figure out what a creative career might look like. What was my path going to be? So I was free to try anything I wanted. And after 6 months, I kind of had to decide, what am I really going to put all of my energy into? And I decided it would be quilt patterns. And now it's evolved into offering lectures and workshops and being involved with the TMQG. So just throwing myself into this community, it wasn't hard to do. And it's been quite a freeing experience to be a part of it.
At first, when we want to get into the business of quilting, we sort of have this this spray. We want to do everything. We think we're going to do this, and this. With time, have you been able to redefine your business model into a smaller niche, or have you spread it even farther?
So I started thinking I would sell quilt patterns. And that's where a lot of my focus in the first year and a half went into. But then when I was asked to lecture, to provide a trunk show, I developed the trunk show, partly curious to see where it would lead and what it would mean for my business. And it's been one of the most rewarding parts of the business, I have to say. I also coupled that with a workshop, which was also an exciting thing to do. It was live, so it wasn't recorded, which I know many quilters are doing. So yes, I was kind of in a few different places. And I think moving forward, I would still focus on quilt patterns and providing lectures. I really love to kind of build a story, tell the story to everyone, and hopefully inspire them by the end of the lecture a little bit to try something new. So I think I'm going to build my catalog for lectures going forward because it has been the most rewarding. And that's what I should stick to. I should stick to the things that are most rewarding to me because I think everyone else will enjoy it if it's rewarding to me as well.
What skills did you bring with you to help you go full time?
Sheer determination. A little bit of naivety, but I really like to have my hands in everything. I'm that type of person where I really take projects on as a whole. And so business is very much that concept. You're doing everything. And I've always been very open to learning. So growing this business I've had to learn everything: how to market, how to build a website, how to quilt, how to write quilt patterns, how to market myself, how to tell my story effectively, how to support my community. All these things are very exciting to me and allow me to kind of figure myself out and where I fit in all of them.
You're in Toronto like me, and you have spent the good part of the last 2 years in either in a bubble or a lockdown. So how did that help you?
Not a lot changed, surprisingly, for me personally. I worked from home before COVID, and I was able just to focus more time on the business, which was difficult in some ways because I didn't get a lot of chance to refuel, to go out, to socialize, to kind of check out of my business. It's all around me in this place, which is exciting and draining. Well, what I will say is before I found quilting, I was I was so unsure of how to use my time. I used to read a lot more, to be fair, but I really didn't know what I would do with 5 free hours. Like I was quite lost, and I'm so grateful. And I told many people this: I was so grateful to have quilting when COVID began because it gave me purpose. Every day, it did give me purpose, and I'd actually be a little worried about who I would be without having quilting to go to every day. So it was very grounding for me. And it was important that I had somewhere to put all that energy.
So you're this year's designer behind the Canadian Quilters Association Mystery Quilt event. How's that going?
It's been an exciting process. So the quilt is called Pay On, and it uses a lot of curves in this design. And because so many folks were going to participate, I kind of turned to a traditional block for this design, which was kind of the first time I've done that, to be honest. And I chose the drunkard's path. And it was so fun playing. I have to say, it was really fun to play with a traditional block and see what I could bring to it. And a lot of my designs have a dynamic element, whether that's some sort of motion or a depth or something. And I wanted to make sure I brought that into this quilt design. So I can't tell you about it, but I can tell you that there is a really cool dynamic element that was really exciting to do.
It's been fun watching the conversation around this quilt because it is quite different from quilts of the past. Are you fascinated by all the colorways that are coming out, the color choices, and how that's affecting your pattern?
The ones I've seen so far have been really great. I have to say, everyone's doing a really good job of following the considerations. A lot of folks are using solids, which is quite nice. That's definitely my area of expertise. And the folks who are using pattern fabrics are still using really nice, well, they're not exactly basics. They almost still read as solids, which is really, really great that folks are able to kind of run through their stash and find all these fabrics that are working together. I think everyone is approaching it really well. And I'm really excited to see how they're all going to turn out. I mean, that's the most exciting part about having a mystery quilt and having folks choose their own colorways and working through it themselves. It's going to be a surprise for everybody, including me. And I can't wait. I only have to wait, I guess, 3 more months, 4 more months.
How many episodes are there in the quilt along?
So there's 6 installments total.
Now, you mentioned you put a label on your quilt. What kind of label do you use?
It depends. So most of my quilts get a cork, a soft cork label with my logo embedded in it. But for just gifts, I still use the classic way of finding a nice scrap of fabric and just writing down who it's for. I just gifted a quilt to my brother-in-law, and it was just really sweet. I think writing out your labels is such a sweet touch, and it makes you feel a little closer to the maker. So in terms of gifting, I definitely use scraps and a marker, and then cork labels for a decorative ships and violins label.
Now, is the cork a nod to your Portuguese heritage?
No, I just thought it was really cool.
It sounds absolutely stunning.
It's this beautiful soft cork. I just thought I wanted to have a really unique label. And the thing about the label that I chose is it hangs over the binding of the quilt. So you see it on the front and on the back. And I really like that because we don't typically sign the front of our quilts. We don't typically put labels on the front of our quilts, but unless someone is intentionally looking, you're not going to see the back, especially if it's hanging somewhere. And so I really love having my logo visible from the front as it's part of the piece.
Where does the name Ships and Violins come from?
So it was inspired by a poem by Pablo Neruda called How Much Happens in a Day. And it's a really beautiful, whimsical poem. And it really spoke to like the variety that I seek in my everyday and how much we can accomplish in a single day. And those 2 words just really popped out to me and spoke to me. And then when I look back, I think part of it too is that they spoke to the craftsmanship of what I do and the timelessness of what I do. And I really want my items to kind of stand the test of time.
Have you experimented with other fabrics in your quilts? You just mentioned cork, but within the quilt itself.
I've used like a loose cotton, woven cotton, like a chore coat, which was a little bit difficult to use, but it had a really interesting weight to it. When you add batting to your quilts, it can sometimes be a bit blocky and have hard edges until you wash it and use it quite a bit, and then it kind of loosens up a little bit. And the chore coat, when I used it, the majority of the quilt was chore coat. It really had a beautiful weight to it, and it reminded you a little bit more of a blanket that kind of snuggles you in. That being said, it's unfinished in my WIP pile, so I do typically stick to quilting cottons for sure.
Have you had the opportunity to travel much for quilting? I know we've been in lockdown for so long, but beforehand, are you going to Quiltcon this year?
I will be going to Quiltcon. Yeah, I'm quite excited. I've primarily been a part of this community virtually. I have not been able to travel. When I started to offer lectures and workshops, it was in the midst of COVID. So a lot of them are still held over Zoom. But I'm quite desperate. I'm quite desperate to walk into a room full of quilts and just indulge and learn.
I cannot believe how much I enjoyed walking into Fabric Spark yesterday. Like I told like about 4 or 5 people, like it was I haven't done that for 2 years. And
Yeah.
it's just, well, one, the stunning quilt fabrics that were there. 2, you just forget that they're available. I've been staring at my stash for 2 years. And not that I haven't bought online, I have, but yeah, just you talked earlier about in lockdown, just not having that break where you go out and refresh yourself. You think of how coming back from Quiltcon, you're just always filled with ideas, or even just a Toronto Modern Guild meeting. You come home and you just feel refreshed in some way, full of possibilities.
Totally. I think when you're part of a creative community, it's so important to interact with others in that community. I mean, that's how we all grow, we learn. It's through sharing. And even though I attended the last QuiltCon together virtually, after I watched the opening ceremony, I raced to my computer and designed a quilt because I was like so inspired by what I was saying. I was like, I have to put this energy somewhere. And it's important that you feed that. And working at the fabric shop, for example, feeds that for me, in that I'm speaking to all these folks about their projects, often that they're really excited about. I kind of just lap it up and I take it home with me and I bring that excitement into my projects. So many ideas coming into that shop every single day. And it's so nice to spend time with my community in that way.
So I mentioned before that you're a fellow member of the Toronto Modern Guild, and you jumped in quickly and joined the executive. And you've continued to be on the executive for, I think this is coming up to your third year.
It'll be my third, yeah.
Third year. So how has that helped you along your quilting journey?
When I decided I was going to make quilting my career, I really wanted to immerse myself in the community. And yeah, it didn't take much for me to put my hand up and volunteer. I've always been a person to jump in. That's clear. So being able to speak with the other executives, understanding what your membership needs and wants, being able to appreciate everyone's work and seeing everyone's creations is incredibly motivating. To also see really candid conversations between our members, during our Zoom meetings, we have those social little 15 minutes where we get to speak to somebody else in the guild, and those are my favorite. They're absolutely my favorite because people are just able to talk about what's on their mind. And I'm so anxious to get meetings back in person for that reason. I think a lot of us thrive on that type of interaction. So fingers crossed, 2022, everyone can come together and we can start to do that all over again.
When you think of walking into a guild, everybody there loves quilting.
Yeah.
Like that's why they're there. Like you have something in common with perfect strangers and you can sit down and immediately have a conversation.
Oh, it was wonderful because when I first started quilting, the only person I could speak to was my fiance. And he knows more about quilting now than he ever wanted to know. So going to the guild meetings in that initial year when I was just a member was just wonderful. Everyone was excited about the things that I was excited about. And that's what you want from your community, whatever that ends up being. You want to be able to share enthusiasm. And so, yeah, 100%, that was definitely one of the things that was exciting, to find my people.
I remember going to, my son does these little game figurines called Warhammer, and walking in that room, and men and boys, it's a very male dominated thing. And they were all happy there. You could just see unbridled joy.
Yeah.
And when I walked into my first QuiltCon, I went, this is my Warhammer. This is exact same feeling.
I totally get it. And like I could walk into like an art museum and not feel the same enthusiasm as I would walk into a QuiltCon, like it's something about the quilts, it's my connection to the craft that really is exciting.
Christina, tell me about the quilt behind you.
All three of them?
Oh, yes, there's three. The one on the bottom is Badlands.
Yes. This is the drop. So this was the third quilt I designed, and it's all FPP. And then the top one is called The Last Kiss, which is partially FPP as well. And they pretty much kept her, I think, 2020 all in one glance. But as you can tell just from looking at them, they're all completely different and they all challenge me in different ways. But you can see The Last Kiss here. I always like to mention the drop used that same element here. That's where I started with these kind of arrowheads. And then I just kind of played around with it to get that second design there. So it was fun just to explore these design elements and see what happens.
Do you have a favorite quilt or favorite design that's a little bit more precious than the others?
A quilt that I made that I gifted. So I made a version of the drop for my sister-in-law when she became a mom of my niece Paula. So that one is meaningful for that reason, as a gifting reason. It was really lovely to hand it off to her. As a designer and a creator, I would say the Square of Pegasus, which is the first star in my constellation series. And the reason I say that is because it has really set the tone for me as a designer. And the series, creating all these different star designs, has really grounded me in my business a little bit because I'm so adventurous in my designs and I don't really know what's coming out next. And that's exciting. But the Star series has given me something to kind of put my roots in, and I'm just going to continue to build on it. And folks have had such a wonderful response to it that it really, I would say, is where I've started to see the ships and violins community the most. And I've met so many folks who continue to follow me through some of my other events. So I would say that that really felt like I was starting to find a community for my work.
We've already talked, you've got a workshop, you've got a lecture. So if people want to contact you, how do they get a hold of you?
There's a contact page on my website at shipsandviolins.com. I will see it immediately and respond to you very quickly.
And your Instagram is?
At Ships and Violins.
Thank you very much for being on the show today, Cristina. It's been wonderful catching up with you and hearing your story. And I look forward to the next installment of the Mystery Quilt.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed my interview with Cristina De Miranda. I hope that you are inspired to lean into your quilting, to find your own voice and be the maker that you can be. If you want to schedule her lecture, purchase her pattern, or follow her online, I'll leave her contact information in the notes below.
And if you act now, she's offering a discount code to all of my viewers.
Next up on Karen's Quilt Circle is Verushka Zarate of Pride and Joy Quilting. Her paper piece designs will take your breath away with their use of color and detail. And you don't want to miss it, so be sure to subscribe. Get ready to stash your sewing room. January 2022, we are clearing out the unwanted and the unnecessary to have the best sewing year ever. Go to justgetitdonequilts.com to join in. Next time you're in your sewing room, make sure you have Karen's Quilt Circle playing in the background. I have interviewed so many amazing quilters on this series. Let one inspire you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.